Okay, so welcome today, everyone, for the Migration Policy Centre's webinar entitled Immigrants, Political Attitudes, Assimilation or Divergence. We have three really interesting speakers today with really interesting papers that will each look at attitudes to immigration from quite an original angle, I think, looking at the attitudes to immigration of immigrants themselves. And I think in doing so, each of them really bring out original theoretical angles. So we're going to have three papers. The first one is Migrants' Attitudes Towards Immigration, Convergence Towards Natives, Evidence from Europe by Michaela Sedovich of the London School of Economics and Lenka Drajanova from the Migration Policy Centre of the EUI. We then have The Political Assimilation of Immigrants, Migrant-to-Native Differences in Western Europe by Jérôme Gonod, also of the Migration Policy Centre. And then finally, we end with Intra-European Immigrants' Attitudes Towards Non-European Immigration by Onyen Obuchina, who's a researcher at the French Institute for Demographic Studies. So each speaker will have 15 minutes to present the paper, and then I think we'll do all the Q&A, a half an hour for Q&A at the end. So I'll ask a few questions as the discussants, and then we'll open the floor to the audience over YouTube and also over Zoom. So if that's okay with everyone, then Michaela, would you mind going ahead and starting your presentation?
Thank you very much. Let me share my slides. And may I ask you to enable me to share slides? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very happy to present today work we are working on currently with Lenka Drajanova on migrants' attitudes towards immigration in Europe, in which we are asking whether these are converging towards natives' attitudes. And migrants' attitudes towards migration are actually quite under-researched issue. And at the moment, when we as researchers are looking at attitudes towards immigrants, most often we focus on the perspective of natives living in the destination countries. And we are asking them what they think about new people coming to live in their home countries. However, we have a blind spot and we don't really understand that well opinions of migrants to other migrants and migrant to migrant attitudes. And that's an important issue because we have migrant populations living in European countries, whether those are current migrants or people with migrant experience in their families because they are children of migrants, or because we can expect more people to migrate to Europe in the future. And these migrant populations and populations of people with migrant experience are a specific population, and also they have specific political opinions. So attitudes towards immigrants can tell us a lot about their integration in the destination countries. They can also tell us a lot about their relations to other immigrants. And we already see emerging research that is looking at the effect of intergroup contact between migrants to other migrants and between different ethnic groups. And attitudes can tell us a lot about what is the environment in which migrants live if they are in touch and if they are in contact with other migrants, whether it's a hostile or welcoming environment. And also, last but not the least, it's important to understand voting preferences, but also, most importantly, migrant and integration support to policies in the destination countries. And we can learn a lot from attitudes towards immigrants about these issues. And luckily, we have data about immigrants' attitudes towards migration, because migrants are part of the samples on which we collect data from surveys such as European Social Survey of Gallup or Gallup. So we can now do the same research as we did until now on attitudes of natives. And what we do in this research, we are asking two questions with Lenka. First, we are asking whether are migrants' attitudes towards fellow immigrants converging to attitudes of non-migrants in the destination countries, and whether that is happening in all dimensions, because we can discuss attitudes towards immigrants and we can ask about attitudes towards immigrants from different perspectives. And secondly, we are asking what are the main determinants that are affecting these attitudes and the change in these attitudes, and also ask whether these determinants are same across different dimensions. So I was speaking a lot about dimensions, but what are these dimensions of attitudes to immigration? As I said, we can ask and think about attitudes to immigration from this different perspectives. We can think about the policies. We can think about the evaluation of specific migrant groups, for example, people from specific countries or people of different religious background. We can have opinions about particular migrants, or we can think about perceived consequences of immigrants living in the destination countries. In this research, we are looking at two of these dimensions of attitudes to immigrants. And specifically, we are measuring both of these in an index, and both of these indexes are created by three questions. Firstly, we are looking at the attitudes from the perspective of opinions on policies. So we are asking migrant respondents whether they would allow specific people to live in the destination countries. And then in the second attitude, we are looking at migrant respondents' perceived effect, how they perceive the effect of immigration in the country where they live, what they think about the general effect of immigration in the country, but also what is the, according to them, the cultural and economic impact of immigration in the destination country. What we learned so far from the previous research is that the most important determinants so far seems to be a convergence in time, so the effect of time, and then the economic situation of individuals living in the destination country. What we learned from Becker and her research in 2019 is that it seems that in the US, the convergence happens quite quickly, and the second generation holds very comparable attitudes towards immigrants compared to non-migrants. In the comparative research of European countries from 2015, again, the acquired citizenship, which can also most of the time be only acquired after living in a country for a specific time, was an important determinant. And even and the attitudes towards immigrants were more comparable between migrants and non-migrants, especially when migrants were not happy with the economic situation in their destination country, which we read as them being threatened by potential of new migrants coming to the destination country. Therefore, they had opinions, they were closer to natives, which in general are usually more negative. Lastly, a comparative research of political attitudes in Europe, which were co-authored by Jerome, who is presenting today too. So I really hope I'm not butchering the interpretation of his research now. They seem in their research that attitudes towards immigrants are again converging in time, and that the migrants' attitudes are getting closer to non-migrants' attitudes in time, especially for those who can naturalize and who can access the new rights in the destination country. Seeing that this is what we already learned, what we hope to bring and how we want to contribute in this research, it's threefold. Firstly, we would like to compare determinants of development of attitudes by looking at the broad number of potential determinants that can affect attitudes towards immigrants. We are comparing first and second generation to natives. But also what we want to bring is the comparison of determinants when we are looking at the two different dimensions of attitude and see whether attitudes towards immigrants are converging at the same time in the same attitudes. Lastly, we would really want to speak to social and public policies with this research. To do that, we are using data from European Social Survey, and we are employing all 9 waves that are currently available. And we are looking at 20 different European countries. As we are comparing immigrants in the second generation to non-migrants, we are including all of these groups into our sample. And our potential determinants of migrants' attitudes are divided in 2 different categories. We are looking at the determinants that could be linked with the economic situation of immigrants and therefore their attitudes. And then when we are looking at the great number of determinants that could be linked to integration, such as naturalization, minority membership, experience discrimination, their region of origin, language which they speak at home, but also their tenure, so length of stay and the age and their age of arrival. We are analyzing our data in the multi-level hierarchical regression model, and we are including a random slope for both of our generations. While I'm not going to present results from models with interactions, I'll be speaking about these results a bit. And while speaking about results, let's jump into it. And first of all, I'll present you the results from the first dimension of attitudes towards immigrants. And here we are looking at the determinants of migrants' attitudes in how they perceive the immigrants' effect on their destination, on the country in which they live. And what you can see on the very top of the figure, maybe we can see my cursor on the screen. We can tell that the first and the second generation hold significantly different attitudes towards immigrants than natives. And while natives' attitudes would be on the vertical line, the first generation are more positive and the second generation are more positive also, but the difference is a bit lower. On average, these numbers would be lower than the average attitudes in the second dimensions, meaning that people are more positive about people coming to live to the destination country than they are positive about the eventual impact of migrants on these countries. What we see in the economic determinants, education and having a higher education and higher income tends to lead people to have more positive attitudes. But when we then look on the migrant characteristics, which are closer to the bottom of this figure, I would like to focus on these in the next couple of minutes. You can see that belonging to a minority ethnic group is linked to more positive attitudes, while acquiring a citizenship in the destination country is linked to more negative attitudes, which is as expected. However, when you look at the determinant feeling discriminated, we can tell that those people who feel discriminated in the destination country hold more negative attitudes towards towards immigration in this particular dimension. And what we believe is happening here is that migrants don't believe that immigrants can positively affect the destination country because they feel discriminated, because they are not allowed to bring as much to the table as they would be if they weren't discriminated. What seems as a puzzle to both of us with my co-author is the result in the determinant speaking a non-national language at home, because we would expect this to go another direction. And we would like to look more into this in the future, but we would also like to discuss it if anybody has an idea how to interpret this. When looking at the other dimension, most of the determinants show the same pattern as we've seen on the previous slide. However, when you look at the top of the figure, what you can see is that the difference between the size of the effect of being a member of the first and the second generation are almost the same, which wasn't the case at the previous slide. Also, when you look at the bottom, at the migrant characteristics, you can again see the difference there. And in this attitude towards immigrants, you can see that those who feel discriminated hold more positive attitudes. So they are more inclined to allow others to come to the destination country. When we want to look at other differences in how determinants affect specific attitudes, dimensions of attitudes, I would like to present another determinant. Here we are looking at the results from the model only for the first generation, where we are looking at the effect of the length of the stay in the country. Again, under the heading migrant characteristics, you can here see how the tenure or how this length of the stay in the country of destination affect the attitudes towards immigrants. We are now comparing those who are in the country 1 to 5 years to more than 21 years compared to those who came just last year. What you can see is that up until to being in the destination country for 20 years, this attitude is not changing significantly. So we can only tell that the convergence is significant and the attitudes are getting more negative and therefore closer to natives after 20 years. However, this is only significant in this particular attitudes towards dimension of attitudes to migration. Because again, I'm now showing the other dimension we are interested in. And as you can see in these results, those people who are staying in the country for more than 21 years still are not significantly different in the attitudes they hold from those who just came last year, which means that the speed or how quickly these attitudes are changing is different for the two dimensions. However, I have to mention here that we are not using longitudinal data, just cross-panel data. But we believe that consider we are controlling for a year when the data were collected, that we can, to a degree, say that this is a time effect. I know I've told you a lot of information, so let me sum up some of the factors that are affecting and what are the take-home messages here. We believe that both immigrants and the second generation hold still have significantly different attitudes towards immigrants compared to non-migrants, even when we compare for the length of stay in the country. And even if they are converging, they are still more positive than non-migrants. We can see that the convergence is probably happening later or happening slower compared to results from the US, where authors are presenting that the attitudes towards immigrants are almost non-different between the second generation and the American non-migrants. We agree with the previous, our results agree with the previous research that the citizenship predicts adverse attitudes, but in our model, we've seen this happening for people in all different economic situations. So the predictor of naturalization was quite stable in our models. We believe that the region of origin is a strong predictor, and also the history of the destination country is a strong predictor of attitudes. And this is true not only for migrants, but also for non-natives. For natives. We saw in our models that there are different determinants are predicting attitudes differently in different dimensions. So we believe that what our research is saying, that we have to look at different dimensions and maybe even different questions asking about attitudes towards immigrants separately, as these might be changing in time differently. What seems as a puzzle for us is that those who are speaking foreign language at home are constantly having worse attitudes than those who are speaking the national language. The research policy implications of these are couple. We believe that that the alliances are stronger between migrants to future migrants or the fellow migrants, the members or natives in their destination countries. And also we believe that while the economic characteristics of an individual are important predictors, also more important predictors are factors that are telling us about the potential integration of these migrants. And lastly, policies, we believe that seeing this, we can in the future see potential divide between migrant groups, which might lead to potential migrant-to-migrant hostility, which could be happening in the European countries on the top of current native-to-migrant hostilities we already see between certain native and certain migrant groups. And we believe that policies could step into this to prevent this migrant-to-migrant hostility from happening by by helping people to integrate quicker and to help them converge their attitudes at the same time and not depending on their ability to integrate. Thank you very much for your attention, and we are happy for comments and questions, as this is still research in early stages and it will be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. That was a really, really fascinating presentation. There's a lot of food for thought there. I'll have a few questions after the next two presentations. So the next one is by Jerome, the political assimilation of immigrants, migrant-to-native differences in Western Europe. But just quickly before Jerome starts, anyone who's watching on YouTube, just whenever you like, put questions in the chat box. And then when we get to the Q&A, I'll read them out then. So go ahead, the floor is yours, Jerome.
Thank you, James. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. So obviously following up on the presentation by Michaela, I'm going to discuss a joint work with Federica Lopolito on the political assimilation of immigrants. We will talk about attitudes to immigration and widen a little bit our focus to other political issues and explore the migrant-to-native gap in political opinion in Western Europe. So a few words of introduction on the relevance of this research question. I don't need to convince you that anti-immigrant rhetoric is growing and gaining more and more political attention across the board. And one of the main drivers of this xenophobic narratives is the impossibility or rejection of the fear of assimilation. So the fact that immigrants cannot assimilate into their host society. And by doing this work, we hope to bring some light on the reality of assimilation and answer some of the questions that people might have about immigrants' assimilation. The second important point that we want to raise in this work, and this is something Michaela has already spoken about, is the political consequences of immigrants' integration. And obviously, looking at how immigrants think about politics is something that matters for a variety of issues and fields, such as electoral outcomes, citizenship and enfranchisement issues, and even political competitions, if you think from a politician's perspective. So that's also something we would like to contribute to with this work. What kind of evidence are we investigating in this paper? We're studying the political opinion gap between first-generation immigrants, so foreign-born immigrants, and natives, people that are born in their country of residence in Western Europe. We cover about 16 countries. Just to give you a rough idea, it's really Western Europe we're talking about. Those countries in green are those that we investigate and focusing on in the paper. We're looking at 5 different political issues. The first one is redistribution. So just a few words about the questions and how these preferences are measured. In terms of redistribution, people are asked whether they would like the government to reduce income inequalities. Next, we look at restrictions on gay rights. And people are asked essentially whether gay people should have the same rights as straight people and live their life as they wish. We look at immigration policy, so directly related to the work Michaela discussed. And we, on the other hand, do not look at different types of attitudes, but we focus on migration policy, essentially whether people want more or less immigrants to come and live in their country. Next, we look at European integration. People are asked whether they would like a European integration process to go further or to be halted and even stopped. And finally, political trust. And this question asks about people's trust in national parliaments and political leaders. We're using the European Social Survey data, which I believe Michaela and Lenka are also using. So we have about 272,000 individual observations, and roughly 8%, so 20,000 of these observations are foreign-born immigrants. The paper has 3 sections, which I'm going to discuss briefly, obviously, in this talk. The first one is really descriptive, is looking at the migrant-to-native opinion gap between 2 individuals in the same country, obviously. The second one is looking into assimilation over time, so the evolution of migrants' political preferences with the time spent in their destination country. And the last section is looking a bit deeper into the assimilation process and explore subnational patterns, so correspondence between natives and immigrants' preferences at the regional level, and even at the sub-regional level through the presence of peer effects. So essentially what we do in the paper is to first, on the one hand, review migrant-to-native differences in political issues. And the second thing we try to do, but it's kind of hard and I will tell you why, but what we're hinting towards is trying to emphasize the heterogeneous nature of political preferences, because we have 5 of them and we see different patterns of assimilations. We try to highlight the fact that political preferences might have distinct drivers. So let's move on now to the first set of results we have in the paper. The main findings of that section is that on average, we do not find any significant differences between migrants and natives on the issue of redistribution. We do find, on the other hand, that they're much more conservative on the issue of gay rights, meaning they would like more restrictions on gay rights. And they are more liberal on issues of immigration policy, European integration, and political trust. So more liberal in political trust simply means that they put more faith into politicians. So they have more faith than natives in national political institutions. So before I comment on the size of these gaps, just want to tell you that obviously I don't have a graph to show you here, but we do control. This is a fairly rigorous empirical exercise, so we do control for individual characteristics that are likely to influence those preferences. By this I mean that we control for education level, we control for gender, we control for age, marital status, a bunch of other individual characteristics. We leave aside some specific migrants characteristics such as religion or citizenship that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but we do control for these individual characteristics. And what we find is that essentially within the same countries, so the average difference across the Western Europe, or the countries that we are looking at, is such that migrants and natives differ in terms of opinion on immigration, European integration, and political trust, with a gap of between 0.04 and 0.06 on a 0 to 1 scale. So you might think this is rather small. I'm not going to get into the details of our empirical analysis, but this is still significant, and this difference is worth emphasizing. And you can see the effect for restrictions on gay rights is twice as large. It's 0.12. So if you want to put things in perspective, you might think that there's a 12% difference in terms of opinion on that issue, whatever that means. But essentially, the key message here is that there's that migrants are more liberal and much more conservative on the issue of on gay rights. Now, when we look deeper into the fundamentals of the drivers of these differences, we see that these differences are much smaller for immigrants that come from high-income countries and countries that are obviously closer to Western European countries on the economic or social level. These differences are also smaller for among immigrants who migrate at a younger age, and those who share linguistic tie with the country of destination. So that all points to the evidence, if you will, that's the socioeconomic proximity and cultural proximity, as well as spending your childhood in the country of destination when you're a migrant, favor assimilation. So that's the interpretation that we make of these results. We also see that religiosity is a major driver of differences on gay rights, which will come as no surprise, but that's important because it does confirm our intuition that this preference, political preference, has strong cultural, deep-seated cultural roots that might differ from the rest of the other political preferences. And finally, we find that citizenship reduces difference on redistribution, immigration policy, and European integration. And the interpretation that we make of this result is essentially that these political preferences have a component, a non-negligible component, that is self-interest, because citizenship comes obviously with opportunities and perks that immigrants without citizenship don't have. And our interpretation here is that, for instance, in the case of redistribution or immigration policy, once you have acquired citizenship in a country, you feel less threatened by restrictive measures or on immigration or exclusion from redistribution, because citizenship essentially gives you the same rights as natives. Now, moving to the assimilation over time, here we face a bit of a challenge from an empirical perspective, because we're not using longitudinal data, which means essentially, in a few words, that we were not able to track immigrants over time and observe the actual change in their preferences, but instead we had to come up with a workaround which takes the form of pseudo cohorts of immigrants, because we do have information about immigrants' decade of arrival in their host country and the time that they have spent at destination, and without getting into technical details here, we're able to build cohorts of immigrants to compare preferences at arrival and over the next 20 years, so 20 years since the time of migration. What we find is that there is no significant change over time for issues of European integration and restriction on gay rights. But we do find that spending 15 years, so migrants would spend between 10 and 20 years actually at destination, show no differences in terms of migration policy with natives. So that's quite a striking result. And we also find that spending roughly 15 years at destination reduces differences in political trust by 80%. That's quite an interesting result, because it shows essentially, and especially for migration policy, that after a while, self-interest or simply cultural differences are completely disappear between migrants and natives, which we didn't expect, to be honest, in the first place. Finally, on the issue of redistribution, we find that immigrants actually become more conservative over time, which means that we don't see much of a difference upon arrival. But as time passes, we do find that migrants become more conservative than natives, and we attribute this effect to migration status and migration experience, which we believe makes it harder to benefit from redistribution than when you're simply a native facing very little discrimination, obviously, in your home country. And that's the interpretation that we make of this result. And moving to the subnational analysis, one of the main reasons why we actually went for a subnational analysis is that I'm sure you can, if you think of your home country, you can see that not everybody at the country level, the national level, think alike. And there are strong differences between regions and sometimes within regions in the way that people think about, I mean, in values and culture, but also in the way people think about politics and political opinions. So that's one of the first reasons why we wanted to do this. The other reason why we're doing this is because we think it helps us distinguish between local culture and national opportunity structures, which means that we are able to control, if you wish, for the effect on preferences of national institutions and focus on differences at the regional or sub-regional level, which helps us tell something about the cultural determinants of political preferences. The first step of this subnational analysis is the regional analysis, where we isolate people at the NUTS2 level. So NUTS2, for those who are not familiar, are subnational areas within European countries with populations between 800,000 and 3 million inhabitants, and isolating people within these clusters or regional areas. We look at the correspondence between preferences of natives and immigrants. And what we find is that natives' preferences actually predict a large share of the preferences of immigrants living in the same region. For redistribution, immigration policy, and political trust, as you can see here. We do not find, however, any significant effect for gay rights and European integration. Now, but we do find that for those political variable for which we find an association, that this association is much stronger for immigrants that have spent more time in their region of destination, which to us points towards an assimilation mechanism. Now, why don't we find anything for gay rights and European integration? That's kind of a tricky question to answer. What we think is happening is for gay rights, as I said before, these political preferences have strong cultural roots and is probably harder to shift than other political preferences. As for European integration, it's a fairly recent issue and was not something that people used to think about. So it's hard to say that there is really a culture or cultural preferences at the regional level about whether European integration should move forward. That's at least our interpretation at the moment. I'll be short on this because I'm already overdue. We'll also have a part where we look at the presence of peer effects. So we look at the sub-regional level and create clusters of individuals based on the region where they live, so rural areas as opposed to cities, the age bands and their occupation, so their jobs basically. And we look at, again, whether there is a correspondence at the local level, so sub-regional local level, with natives, with their natives peers. And what we find is that essentially for all preferences but redistribution, there is some small association between the two, which means that natives peers preferences at the sub-regional level can predict a small share of the preferences of immigrants. Now, this confirms our intuition for political trust in immigration policy, which so far, as you've seen, point towards a classic assimilation pattern. It confirms also intuition redistribution, which is that redistribution obeys different mechanisms than the other political preferences, and especially is probably more determined by self-interest and opportunity structures than it is determined by cultural drivers. In the gay rights and European integration preferences, on the other hand, we have a little bit more trouble explaining what lies behind this. We have some explanation that we put forward in the paper, and in particular the possibility of selective local acculturation, which I don't have time to elaborate on right now, but maybe in the Q&A session. And finally, the takeaway message of this work and of this presentation, I guess, is that migrant-to-native differences are not homogeneous when it comes to political issues. They do vary a lot, but migrants can be more conservative or more liberal, or simply just think like natives on some issues. And these gaps in preferences owe a lot to migrants' characteristics, and in particular to their background. So the country they come from, their religion, whether they have ties to their country of destination before migrating, etc. The convergence over time and at the regional level show that there is assimilation, at least on some political issues. So that answers one of the questions that I was asking at the beginning of the presentation. And these patterns of assimilation depend, in our interpretation, on the nature of political preferences and probably on migration experience as well. The work has some limitation, mainly as a result of the nature of the data that we're using, which is not longitudinal. And there is obviously some tests that we cannot pursue and cannot run, test of acculturation, because of this data issue. That makes the interpretation a little bit more difficult, but we hope to see more research in this area. And as Michael Lenka's work has shown, this is actually happening. So we're very happy to see that, and looking forward to read the results of their work and other work in this on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerome, for the very interesting presentation. We're now going to switch to our final paper, which is by Onyen Obuchina on intra-European immigrants' attitudes towards non-European immigration. So whenever you're ready, Onyen, go ahead.
Can you see the slides?
We can now, yes.
Okay, good. Should I switch to full screen? I guess I should.
Yes, please.
So good afternoon to everyone. I'm Onyen Obuchina. I'm a researcher at INED, which is also known as the French Institute of Demographic Studies. I'm very glad to be with you here, and in what follows, I will present you my ongoing study titled Inter-European Migrants' Attitudes Towards Non-European Immigration. So this is very much work in progress. Any constructive comment will be highly appreciated or precious. So those of you who are acquainted with this literature will probably know that the overwhelming majority of these studies focus on natives' attitudes towards immigrants. However, today many or most developed countries are more diverse than ever in the modern history. And if we are to grasp the complexity of intergroup relations in multicultural societies, it is essential to examine cross-group attitudes among minority groups as well. So although this study is not strictly speaking placed in the majority-minority framework, it does deal with individual attitudes toward out-group members, which implies that some classical concepts usually found in the studies of natives' attitudes are also relevant for mutual attitudes among minority groups. For instance, the ethnic competition framework or intergroup contact theory, they're both indeed very relevant when studying mutual attitudes among migrants, as these concepts can be applied to relationships between any two groups. All of these important concepts should be taken into account when setting up the analytical model, or at least when interpreting the results. The focus in this study is on something else. What I'm especially interested in is to analyze whether inter-European immigrants' attitudes towards non-European migration are shaped, and if yes, to what extent, by the attitudes towards non-European immigration among natives in both the destination and origin country. Putting it more simply, maybe slightly too simply, do the inter-European migrants acquire their attitudes towards non-European immigration at the destination, or do they bring these attitudes from home? Now, given the main research question, we should maybe take a step back and ask ourselves, why should we believe that other people's or other groups' attitudes affect our own attitudes? One of the major mechanisms at work here is conformity. So in particular, it is argued that people intuitively believe that if more people share their view, then that view is correct. And on the other hand, disagreement with people around us can destabilize our attitudes and trigger a change in attitudes. There are three principal channels of social influence on individual attitudes. First, there's the influence of mass media and elites. Then we have personal social contact, whereby the change in attitudes emerges as a result of information exchange. And finally, some researchers argue that not even information exchange is a necessary condition for a change in attitudes to take place. They claim that under certain conditions, even knowing what the prevailing views are in our environment may prompt us to adjust our attitudes into that direction. The main assumption in this study is that immigrants' attitudes towards other groups are influenced by corresponding attitudes in majority groups. But why should we believe that this is the case? Why expect precisely this directional influence, and why wouldn't it be the other way around? Well, first, if we think of media and elites as one of the key channels of social influence, they're clearly dominated by natives in pretty much all major destination countries. And second, the logic of numbers also comes into play. As in most destination countries, natives clearly outnumber immigrants. An average immigrant knows more natives than a native knows immigrants. So there are good reasons to believe that the channels of social influence from natives towards immigrants will be stronger than those going in the opposite direction. Conformity is a well-researched topic. It's a classical topic of social psychology. On the other hand, counterconformity, or defiance to group norms, or non-conformity, or the absence of conformity, have both attracted less attention in previous studies. At the same time, and given, again, the nature of this research question and the relationship between the social groups in question, we cannot rule out that immigrants, to at least some extent, form their attitudes in the opposition to the native group. Previous studies namely show that conformity is stronger when it includes judgments on physical reality, for instance, in the experiments where respondents are asked to judge the length of a line. But at the same time, the early work also suggests that conformity may be weaker on issues that include a certain moral component, especially when a respondent feels involved in the particular issue. And if we agree with Douglas Massey that migration is one of the most emotive subjects of contemporary social science, then we can safely assume that immigrant respondents feel very much involved when asked questions about migration. And in fact, earlier work does show that counterconformity is not a purely theoretical concept. Some US and Israeli studies indeed found evidence to support it. Also, what makes us think that immigrants' views towards immigrants from other groups will be different, more favorable, or even possibly opposed to the attitudes among natives? This question becomes even more relevant knowing that the major mechanism generating negative views among natives, which are those explained by the group competition framework, these mechanisms can also be at play for mutual attitudes among immigrants, different immigrant groups. So some scholars have discussed the concept of the so-called immigrant solidarity. So according to this perspective, immigrants are likely to have more positive attitudes towards other immigrants as compared to natives. But why? At least two mechanisms are at work here. All immigrants, whatever their country of origin, whatever their self-declared or ascribed identity, they share an important common experience, which is migration to another country. And this experience should create a sense of solidarity and kinship, even with immigrants from other immigrant groups. And furthermore, more positive attitudes among immigrants may emerge as a result of cognitive dissonance avoidance. So this is a more general concept, not directly related to migration, but in this context, basically, it is based on the belief that individuals who made the choice to migrate should evaluate positively that same choice made by others. So all these considerations set stage for first two hypotheses in this study, two competing hypotheses. So taking into account the exposure to the native attitudinal context and assuming a moderate degree of identification with non-European immigrants, the conformity hypothesis predicts that the attitudes towards non-European immigration among intra-European migrants will be positively associated with those among natives from the host country. The alternative opposition hypothesis predicts that the attitudes towards non-European immigration among intra-European migrants will be negatively associated with those among natives from the host country. The third hypothesis is very simple and intuitive. It is based on the assumption that socialization in the home country before migration for those who migrate as adults and parental influence at home for those who migrate at a younger age will also directly or indirectly shape immigrants' views towards other groups. So the home country hypothesis predicts that European immigrants' attitudes towards non-European immigration are positively associated with the attitudes expressed by natives in the home country. So as for data, use European Social Survey runs 1 to 9, and for one variable, I also use UNDP Human Development Index. I used all the data, basically all data from all countries that participated in European Social Survey at any point, but only 15 of these countries participated in all 9 rounds, and I end up with a sample of slightly less than 25,000 intra-European migrants. So Europeans living in a European country other than their country of birth. As for the methodology, the dependent variable is based on the attitudes towards immigration from poorer countries outside Europe. We can come back to this issue later, why poorer countries and rather than richer or just any countries. So the question, the respondents are asked, to what extent do you think that country of residence should allow people from the poorer countries outside Europe to come and live here? And therefore, possible answers: allow many, allow some, allow few, and allow none. And in the remainder of this presentation, the answer allow many will be referred to as strongly positive attitudes, allow some are moderately positive attitudes, allow few are moderately negative attitudes, and allow none are strongly negative attitudes. The multivariate analysis is based on multi-level, multi-domain model with 3-level structure. Respondents form level 1. They're nested within community years or community rounds, level 2, which are nested within communities. Communities are combination of country of origin and the country of destination. Main independent variables, there are 2 main independent variables, are natives' attitudes towards non-European immigration in country of destination and in the country of birth. And these variables are also, I use data from European Social Survey to construct these variables. How do I operationalize these independent variables? It's basically the share of native respondents in the country of destination or country of birth with either moderately or strictly negative attitudes in the same ESS round. So basically I lump together respondents with moderately negative attitudes and those with strictly negative attitudes, and we can discuss this decision maybe later as well. Other covariates, it's a quite wide range of socio-demographic and contextual characteristics: age and its square term, sex, years of education, years since migration, employment status, citizenship, experience of discrimination, size of non-European population in the country in terms of percentage, and Human Development Index at origin and destination. So first descriptive results. On this slide, I compared the attitudes towards non-European immigration in 4 different groups. Natives are defined here as native-born individuals with 2 native-born parents. Then we have European immigrants, the group in the focus in the study. Then we have non-European immigrants. And for the sake of comparison, I also look at the attitudes of 2nd generation, regardless of the country of parental origin. So it is important to know that to enable a meaningful comparison of attitudes across groups and over time, this graph only looks at 15 countries that participated in all 9 rounds of the survey. So in this first graph, I look at the frequency of negative attitudes in general without making distinction between strongly and moderately negative attitudes. And it turns out, probably not very surprisingly, that natives are a group with the most negative attitudes. In the first 5 rounds, around half or even more than half of natives had negative attitudes towards non-European immigration. However, we also observe somewhat less negative attitudes in the subsequent rounds. The group with the most favorable attitudes are non-European immigrants. Again, not very surprising, because what most of these groups members are expressing are actual attitudes towards immigration of in-group members. Yet the actual share of respondents within this group with negative attitudes may be surprisingly high. It even goes above 40% in some years. European immigrants and 2nd generation, as this graph shows, have fairly similar attitudes towards non-European immigration and are placed between natives and non-European immigrants. So it is noteworthy that the attitudes became somewhat or even substantially more positive in the latest 2 rounds of the European Social Survey. This may be a result of migration crisis of 2015, when solidarity with migrants who risked their lives to reach Europe was at its peak. For the sake of time, I may just skip this graph for now. I will just move directly to the main results. So the main results. Model 1 only controls for natives' attitudes at destination, whereas Model 2 controls for those at both destination and origin. So why this distinction? Well, given that these variables are also based on the information in the European Social Survey, we should bear in mind that we do not have data for all countries of origin in all the rounds of the ESS. So for this information to be available, it would be necessary that the country of origin actually participates in the ESS in the same round, but this is not always the case. So as a result, the number of observations drops by around 1/3 once I include both attitudinal contexts rather than country of destination only. And I will discuss the implications of this later. Starting from Model 1, it suggests a positive statistically significant association between natives' attitudes towards non-European immigration and those of intra-European immigrants. In other words, attitudes among European immigrants will be more negative in the countries where negative views are more widespread among natives. There's also a gradient as the strength of association increases as the attitudes become more negative. So in concrete terms, when a comparison is made to the base outcome, and as this slide suggests, the base outcome are strictly positive attitudes, a 1 percentage point increase in negative attitudes among natives at a destination corresponds to 1% increase in the odds of moderately positive attitudes, a 4% increase in the odds of moderately negative, and a 5% increase in the odds of strictly negative attitudes among intra-European immigrants. As for Model 2, 3 main conclusions emerge. First, more negative attitudes towards non-Europeans at home also correspond to more negative attitudes among intra-European immigrants, and the association is statistically significant as well. Second, the magnitude of the association is considerably smaller when a comparison is made with natives' attitudes at the destination. And third, although the sample is now smaller by 1/3, the inclusion of natives' attitudes at origin has almost no effect on the coefficients for natives' attitudes at destination. I will now quickly guide you through other results. So the analysis suggests that identifies factors that increase negative attitudes or are not associated with attitudes. So the analysis suggests that education, own experience of discrimination, and higher human development index at origin are factors that decrease negative attitudes. Factors that increase negative attitudes are age, being male, years since migration, but only after 15 years, and being a citizen of destination country. At the same time, employment status, group size, and Human Development Index at the destination are not associated with attitudes towards non-European immigration among intra-European migrants. So this brings me to the end of this presentation. In conclusion, the results support the conformity hypothesis and the home country hypothesis, suggesting that the attitudes among intra-European migrants are shaped by attitudinal context in both the destination and origin country, with the former being more important than the latter. However, we should bear in mind that these are preliminary results and some methodological dilemmas still remain. For instance, I use multinomial logic, but multinomial logic does not really respect the hierarchical structure of the answers offered in the questionnaire. An alternative would be generalized ordered logic, yet this technique is very difficult to apply in a multi-level setting. Then also when it comes to the operationalization of the main dependent variable, it may appear somewhat arbitrary, but then it would be, at the same time, it is very difficult to think of a way to construct this variable that would not be arbitrary. And finally, there's the issue of the temporal dimension of the attitude formation. So in particular, in a recent, I think still unpublished, but yet accepted European Sociological Review paper by Maureen Egger and colleagues, using the US data, they show that adolescent years are crucial for the formation of attitudes toward outgroups. In other words, the contextual features that affect the attitudes can be both geographical and temporal. It may thus be necessary to incorporate this perspective into the theoretical discussion, and if possible, in the empirical model as well. More precisely, it is possible that the age at migration should play more prominent role in the empirical model. So that would be all for today. Many thanks for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you, Ognian. That was a really interesting paper. I really like the setup of that paper as well. So I have quite a few questions, but I think we'll just go straight to the YouTube live chat box because there's just quite a lot there. So I'll just start with the questions for the first paper by Michaela and Lenka. So this one is from Alina. Have you taken into account the gender aspects? Are women integrated more difficultly in the host society compared to men? And then the second question, I think this was actually for Jerome, so we'll just stick with the first one there. So it's just about the gender aspect. Have Lenka and Michaela taken into the gender aspect in terms of integration compared to men?
Well, our paper is focused more on attitudes towards immigrants, so we can't really speak about integration in general. But in that paper, we took into account gender, and we control for gender in all our models. In most of the models, gender differences were insignificant, but in those where it was significant, the actual size of the difference between attitudes of men and women were so small that it was really not substantially significant to interpret it. So it's controlled for the gender aspect.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question for your paper though as well while you're speaking now. So I thought it was a really interesting paper, and I think it answers a lot of questions, but I just wonder in terms of the big theoretical questions in terms of why there's this gap by first and second generation. I mean, to me, that's one of the more interesting findings, or one of the key findings anyway. Do you see it as, going on to Ognian's paper actually to some extent, do you see it as the act of migrating? So is it something, I'm thinking, is it something that happens before migration, that there's a self-selection thing going on? Is it something during migration, or is it while they're immigrants, if you see what I mean? So each of those could be potential separate effects. What is the sort of the big theoretical idea there? Is it a predisposition, or is it actually a socialization effect? And then my second question is, and this is actually true for all three papers really, or at least the first two, could you possibly look at other minority groups as well who aren't immigrants? Is there any way to do that? Because that might answer some of the theoretical questions about sort of whether it's the act of immigrating or whether it's, just being a minority group. Go ahead, Lenka. I can see you've got your hand up. I'll let you two choose amongst yourselves.
Thank you, James. I might just add something, and maybe then Michaela wants to add something more. So to your first question, I, on the other hand, think it's not that surprising, actually, what we find, because as we look in the literature of attitudes formation and not really just attitudes to immigration, we know that these attitudes form quite early in life, and what matters is the period until a certain age. So, for example, the first generation might have grown up in the country of origin and moved only later, whereas the second generation, that means that actually grew up in the country of destination. So being kind of integrated into the culture of the origin country, and that's what we observe. We observe that attitudes of the second generation are much more closer to the native population than those of the first generation, so people that potentially did not grow up in the country of destination. So I think this plays quite well with all previous literature that we know about attitudes formation in general. So I did not find these findings surprising, to be honest, because I think they play quite well with what we know so far about how people form their attitudes.
Michaela, did you want to say something, or does that cover it?
Maybe just, I completely agree with Lenka, but also there are results from our research we haven't presented today. And what we saw was also big differences in attitudes between people coming from different countries, in the first generation. So I think this further speaks to research we already saw by Ognjen today, that there is this effect of the origin country or descending country, which speaks to what Lenka just said. So I would say these are just like factors that just add up on each other.
Okay, I also wonder, in terms of the destination country effects, whether someone came by free movement or not has a difference, because the bar is so much higher to come from outside the EU. That surely has some self-selection effects, probably to make people more pro-migration, I guess, because they're more likely to be well-educated, for example, but controlling for education, I don't know. Did you have a chance to think about that or have a look at that?
We've seen that those coming from the country of a similar background, those in a destination country of similar background. So we were looking at migrant and EU and non-EU countries, also new and old EU countries, that people within those categories had a more similar attitudes. But also we saw that people coming from outside Europe hold a bit more positive attitudes towards immigrants. But we didn't look. That those are all preliminary results, and we didn't look that deep into these differences yet. Also because we are not looking at the specific countries of origin, just the sending regions. So for example, we are not looking particularly at a single country, but at the whole Southeast Asia, for example. I think maybe Ognjen would have answer for that question, maybe.
I actually wanted to tackle your puzzle. The result was that speakers of non-national languages have more negative attitudes. Exactly. I personally don't find that result surprising at all, because I think that the way the question was asked was basically it's about autochthonous national minorities in the countries of destination. And it's very possible that they perceive immigration, because when an immigrant settles in Finland, let's say in Helsinki, a huge majority will learn Finnish rather than Swedish. If they move to Wales, very few of them will learn Welsh. So it is possible that certain minority groups see the settlement of a substantial number of foreign-born individuals as a threat to their minority culture and minority language. So I would interpret that result from that perspective. Although I guess with some cross-tabs, you can see where these differences between speakers of non-national languages and speakers of national languages, where these differences are most pronounced, and whether that's actually the case in the countries with substantial minority groups.
Thank you. We'll have to look at that.
Jerome, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's actually a question on the first paper, because I guess we're taking papers one by one. Was wondering, I guess I should have know the answer to this question myself, but whether there's a possibility to look at attitudes to immigration, whether immigrants see immigration just as big as a problem as natives do. So in terms of salience, really, I know there's been a few studies on that issue, and I wanted to know whether you have the possibility, provided this data is available somewhere, to compare whether immigrants, when you showed us that they're more positive towards immigration, but whether they think what they think of immigration in terms of how important it is as an issue for the country where they live.
Thank you for this question. So to my knowledge, in the ESS, there is no such question, so we cannot test it directly. But as far as I am aware, there is this type of question in the Eurobarometer. So we could tackle this question with different data. Maybe it could be an edit analysis. So, and this could be answered potentially using a different set of data, whether the immigrant subset also views the immigration as a very salient issue in these destination countries, or what is the difference between natives and immigrants regarding salience. On the other hand, I wonder whether this wouldn't be a completely different paper at a certain point, which, I mean, would be definitely interesting, but maybe it's too many questions and too many answers in one study.
Okay, Jerome, you still have your hand up. Is that from before, or? Okay, I'm going to read out some of the questions from the chat box then. So we have Alina again. This one was for Jerome. What about the religion aspects? Do the Christian immigrants integrate easily in European societies compared to those of a different religion? And then from Denise, we have, is there any data on linguistic integration in those countries? In many countries, they need certificate language, some kind of language certificate to get citizenship, whereas other countries offer free learning opportunities. And then from Vicky, we have, this one's also to Jerome. Interesting to think about why attitudes towards gay rights are sticky, whereas others aren't. The crucial difference seems to be that the former tap into moral values and conceptions of social justice, whereas the latter also include a self-interest component. She then cites Alexander Kustov's recent paper about the stability of political attitudes. So, Jerome, I don't know if you have an instant reaction to that, but I'll also just throw in a quick question while we still have time. So, I thought your paper was also very interesting. There was a lot there in terms of the different political attitudes, and I just wonder if, because they're such distinct topics, and only attitudes to immigration is immediately obviously connected to the immigrant, non-immigrant distinction. What is sort of the theoretical idea tying all of these together? Or is it, I mean, totally fair enough if it's just a descriptive investigation into an attitudinal gap?
Right, thank you, James. So I'll answer the question in the order you asked them. So the first thing about Christian immigrants, we do find that they integrate so at the religious level better than Muslim immigrants, for instance. So by better, maybe might not be the right word here, but the idea is that the differences in political attitudes are smaller for these immigrants, so Christian immigrants, than they are for Muslim immigrants, but they are still slightly larger than for immigrants who claim that they're not religious, so they're not affiliated with any religion. we don't have a proper, in-depth analysis of what this means, but I guess what this could tell us is that these immigrants have a set of cultural and religious beliefs that make them perhaps less sensitive to assimilation or acculturation than those who do not believe in a particular religion and don't have a particular religion, and are therefore perhaps more sensitive to assimilation. But that's a conjecture, and we don't have actual data on this. But we do find that the gap for Christian immigrants is smaller than for Muslim immigrants, but still slightly larger than for immigrants without religion. The question about the data on linguistic integration, we do have, to the best of my knowledge, in the ESS, there's a question about the language that is spoken at home by immigrants. But we don't really have any measure of integration in the sense that, migrants or foreign-born individuals would tell the interviewer whether they speak the national language at home or whether they speak another language, and in that case, they usually specify which language they speak. But we can't really relate that to citizenship. I mean, yeah, I can probably tell you that the share of people speaking the national language at home is higher among those immigrants who have citizenship, but that's about as much as we know on that issue. And the free opportunities for learning, that's not something we can look at. I mean, at least in the data set that we're using, because there are no questions about whether people are taking language courses, at least not that I know of. And the question about the comment from Vicky on the nature of preferences on the issue of gay rights, you're absolutely right, and that's also our interpretation that basically they're more sticky because they tap into moral values and probably deep-seated beliefs about maybe religion, I mean, as well, and they're therefore harder to shift or harder to evolve over time, as opposed to the other preferences that have a larger component of self-interest. I mean, I mentioned citizenship during the presentation. This is obviously true as well of redistribution, and I mean, it's true for redistribution. It might be true as well for European integration, although to a lesser extent. But I fully agree with this comment. And this is something we try actually to highlight, also to emphasize that the heterogeneity in the nature and drivers of these political preferences. That's also one of the messages that we're trying to communicate, convey, is that people shouldn't regard political preferences as a homogeneous set of preferences in the sense that they all respond to the same kind of mechanisms, etc. And yeah, very, very good point as well for the fact that political attitudes form at an early age. We are well aware of this, and this is one of the actually main challenge related to the data that we have. So not longitudinal data, we have, as I said, cohorts that we build, and there is a high correlation between the time spent at destination and the age at which immigrants arrive in the country. And this correlation is, I mean, when I say it's high, it's really high, and it's almost too high to make sure that the effect that we observe and that I stressed during the presentation is not partly driven by the age at which migrants arrived in the country. So it's very possible then those that have stayed for, and I told you, spending 15 years during the presentation, but those that have spent 20 years and 25 years, that if they are in fact closer to natives, and on political preferences, this might be related to the fact that they came to live in their country of destination at an early age, rather than just the absolute effect of time spent at destination. So obviously the two are very much correlated, but it's a very good point. And finally, James, to answer your question, so I guess what I said about gay rights is one of the pillar of our theoretical framework here. So the idea that the unifying theory behind this work is not only to look at, to provide a description of the difference between natives and immigrants, it's also to point that political preferences are by nature, diverse, because some of them, for instance, attitudes to gay rights tap into moral values, where others might do so, but a lot, a lot less, and might respond to self-interest, and that explains both the difference that we observe between migrants and natives, but also the way they might evolve over time. And that's sort of the theory, if you will, that we're trying to use to link all the comparative analysis in the paper.
Okay, that's great, Jerome. So I just have one last question for Ogmian. So there's a lot of talk about attitudes to immigration being stable, formed early in life, very hard to budge. But your paper and the other two papers as well, really, one thing I really like about your paper is you show both these early life socialization effects, I guess, because of the effect from the origin country. But then if there is some effect from the destination country, some convergence, that surely shows that attitudes are malleable, that they are changeable. I don't know if you could reflect on that a bit.
In order to really, in the lack of longitudinal data, I guess the only way to deal with this would be to interact age at migration with some other variables. I cannot think of a way like off top of my head, but this is something that has to be taken into account and taken very seriously. I cannot give very precise answer right now.
Sure. Do you think that there's any chance that the reason that people's attitudes converge could it be self-selection in some way, that people emigrate to countries that have a sort of similar outlook to themselves, or maybe that's
I have thought about that, but then I cannot think. It's a bit difficult for me to think of a selection mechanism that would make me prefer to a country where the attitudes are more negative. I think that from the perspective of as at least partly rational actors, which immigrants should aim to. Assuming that there is a perfect information, that pretty much all immigrants would prefer to move to a country where attitudes towards immigrants are more positive, all else equal. So there may be some selection mechanisms. Maybe some immigrants simply do not care so much about that. So maybe that could be the dividing line. How much do you care about the attitudes among the natives rather than what the actual attitudes are? Because again, for me, it's very difficult to think to think of someone. Why would you prefer to go to a country where people just don't like you? So
yeah. Okay, so I think we're running a little bit over time, so I think we have to wrap it up at this point. I thought there were three really interesting papers. I hope I get to see them published before too long. And thank you to all three speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.